Thanks all of you for coming. I'm glad to be here to talk a little bit about economics and the environment. So I hope you'll find this talk interesting. I had fun sort of thinking about what to say. I mean, I think about economics and the environment every day of my life. Like, it's what I do for 40 hours a week or more sometimes, thinking about these sort of issues. So I'm really eager to share kind of a first impression. Like, if I had 60 minutes to explain sort of what I do as an environmental economist, what would I say? And so this is going to be what I would say with the 60 minutes. And so I'll talk for about 60 minutes, and then I guess we'll have Q&A if you have anything interesting that you want to ask me. So when we think of economics, we probably think of like supply and demand. And then when we think of the environment, maybe we think of like birds or other sort of animals, or we think of pollution coming out of smokestacks. So there's kind of a goofy little picture that sort of represents the combination of both of those things. That economics, it's all about business, and it's all about consumers and suppliers and these kind of rational decisions. And then the environment, it seems like it should be something separate. We should be thinking about environmental policy, different people, different department in the university, you know. But what I want to convince you of is that economists have a lot of interesting things to say about the environment, about environmental policy. And if we think about environmental issues through the mind of an economist, or as an economist thinks about it, then I think we'll learn a lot of interesting stuff about the environment and how we should think about the environment. So I want to start by giving this sort of overview or introduction, like to directly answer that question: how do economists think about the environment? We'll talk a little bit about what we can call like myths of the market, or misconceptions about the way economists think about the world. Maybe you don't have any of those misconceptions, but a lot of people do. And what that says about how economists can study environmental problems. And then we'll talk a little bit about some specific issues like distributional issues with the environment. And then I want to go over two kind of specific applications, things that environmental economists work on. And the last one is something that I work on that I think hopefully you'll find interesting and relevant, and we'll begin to see how this stuff that I've been talking about earlier comes into play and comes into practice. So I want to talk about climate change and using these things called integrated assessment models, these economic models to study climate change. And then the last thing I want to talk about is something I'm really excited about that I've been working on recently called geoengineering. So we'll get to that in a bit. But first, let's sort of get this overview of how economists think about the environment. And I'll start here. So if you've taken economics class, or you know maybe one thing about economics, you might have heard of this theory called the invisible hand. Has anyone heard of the invisible hand theory? Okay. Yeah, good. I see some visible hands raised up. So that means a lot of people have heard of this. Does anyone want to like tell me what it means in words? Can anyone summarize the theory? Yes, sir.
Supply and demand naturally reach equilibrium as people want things in more or less.
Very good. It naturally reaches equilibrium. That's a very good explanation of the invisible hand. There is no actual hand, but it's like there was this invisible hand that were guiding people to this equilibrium outcome, and that outcome is, in a sense, the ideal outcome, or the optimal outcome, or sort of the perfect outcome. So we can think of the myth of perfect markets being this idea that free markets always work well, and that if we just let the economy run on its own, if we let capitalism go on its own, we're going to get to this ideal equilibrium. We're going to get exactly where we want. So I tried to come up with a good icon or a good figure to sort of convey the invisible hand, and I think I did a pretty good job. Get it? So yeah, the invisible hand theory is basically like, let's let free markets run wild, and then we're going to do great. And if governments ever try to step in and intervene according to this theory, then they're just going to make things worse. And if you follow political debates, you can tell who's on which side of this debate. But I guess I'm going to submit that that's a myth, and that in fact most economists don't think that way. And most economists realize that the invisible hand theory is this great way to think about things, and a great way to think about sort of how markets would work in an ideal situation, but there's just a whole lot of situations in the real world where they don't work that way. In fact, we have this fancy term for when markets don't achieve the optimum, when markets fail. Does anyone know what that fancy term is for when markets fail? It's called market failure. It's pretty straightforward. We just call it market failure. We say sometimes the markets don't work well. In fact, so I teach the sort of introductory microeconomics class, and it only takes me until about like the fourth week of the class before we start talking about market failure, which is where there's cases where the markets aren't perfect, where the invisible hand, it might guide the market somewhere, but it's not guiding the market to the place where we want the market to end up. So the key example of this thing we call market failure in the context of environmental economics is this term that you might have heard of called externalities. The idea being something like pollution. Pollution sort of damages the environment, and it's not being accounted for by the people who produce it. The businesses, the producers who build stuff, and they make pollution as a byproduct, and they're sort of not accounting for the damages that that pollution causes onto others. And that's this market failure caused by pollution. There are other causes of market failure. There are other types of market failure besides pollution, besides externalities, but that's kind of the one that's most relevant for environmental economics. We'll come back to that in a bit. Some people, let me just say this. So I was just on, is anyone on Twitter? Has anyone heard of Twitter? Yeah? Okay, so I was on the Twitter, and I just tweeted some article, which I thought was a pretty innocuous article. It's an economics paper about trade and this kind of thing. I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I got a reply or a response from this guy, and he's a nice guy, I'm sure. He's an environmentalist, he's for environmental policy, and the tweet was something like, oh, these economists, they're all the same, they don't care about the earth, and I could have replied to him, but I didn't, I just let it pass. But I think there's this conception, I don't want to characterize all environmentalists this way, there's this conception maybe among environmentalists that the economists are just looking out for business, they're just looking out for corporate interests, they're just a bunch of shills who are getting paid to sort of defend the free market. And so I want to oppose that view, because I'm not a shill getting paid by corporate interests to defend the free market. I'm sort of studying when the market fails and how we can make things work better and how we can improve people's lives. So you probably know that we look at things, the two things that we want to look at when we're studying policies, costs and benefits. I just realized after I put this diagram up, this figure up, that I found, from clip art, that's a terrible figure because it suggests that we're balancing costs and benefits, right? We don't really balance costs and benefits. We don't want them to be equal. We want the benefits to be really high and the cost to be really low. We want net benefits to be high. So I don't know who came up with this idea of balance, and I don't know why I was the one who decided to put it on my slide presentation. So we care about benefits and costs. We don't want them to be equal. We want the net benefits to be as high as possible. So, and in particular for any economic policy, there's going to be costs and benefits. There's going to be winners and losers. So in particular, when we think about environmental policies, the benefits to environmental policy are the fact that there's going to be emissions reductions, there's going to be less pollution in the world, less climate change in the world, so people's health outcomes are going to be better, there's going to be fewer people who are sick from pollution, who are going to the doctor. Those are benefits. And then we might think there's probably going to be costs to reducing that pollution as well, because the producers are going to have to spend money on new technologies to reduce pollution. Maybe they're going to have to produce less. Maybe you'll have to pay more for gasoline. So there's a whole bunch of costs that we have to balance or compare anyways to the benefits that we get from the pollution reductions. And so we do, we analyze costs and benefits, and we usually call it a benefit cost analysis. And so there's a lot of, another one of these myths is that the point, some people would argue that, oh, benefit cost analysis, they're just, this way that the economists can stop anyone from doing environmental policy. And there's some people who would say we shouldn't think about environmental policy in terms of a benefit cost analysis because it's just not a good way to think about things. It's not an economics problem, it's an environmental problem. So I don't think that's true. So I just pulled a table from a benefit cost analysis that was done. So this was done, about 25 years ago. It was actually done in 1990. And they looked at the CAA, which is the Clean Air Act, and they did this retrospective study. So they looked at the first 20 years of the Clean Air Act, and they looked at its benefits and costs. And then they sort of predicted over the next 20 years, when they were doing this in 1990, what the subsequent benefits and costs would be. And then they look at this other ozone policy as well. And so, they have a lot of economists and environmental scientists who are adding these things up, and they're looking at how much it costs to enact this policy, and they're looking at what we got from it in terms of benefits, health benefits, and so on. And you can see that it looks like we did a pretty good job. It looks like the Clean Air Act, over the first 20 years it was around, got us a huge net benefits, $22 trillion in benefits, and it only cost $523 billion. So it costs a lot of money. We're not lying about those costs, but it looks like it on net was really good. So the cost-benefit analysis in this case makes the environmental policy looks great. And there's plenty of environmental policies that come out looking great under cost-benefit analysis. Of course, there's some that don't end up looking so great under cost-benefit analysis. But we can use cost-benefit analysis to evaluate a policy and say whether or not it was a good idea. And then as we'll see later on, we can use cost-benefit analysis type models to help us design policy. How much should we be reducing pollution, and how much should we be investing in pollution abatement technology, and so on. These numbers, by the way, are really big too. In 1990 US GDP was $6 trillion. And so we've got, over 20 years, we've got benefits that are equal to like 4 years worth of GDP. That's like really, really big benefits. Because you might know in 1970, when the Clean Air Act was first passed, pollution levels were pretty high. And now they're a lot lower. Okay, so we've got net benefits that look pretty good, at least for these policies. Okay, but net benefits hides a lot of things. It hides the fact that I mentioned earlier that there's the net benefits are positive, but there's still some winners and some losers. The benefit cost analysis told us that the winners should outnumber the losers, or at least the value of how much they won should outnumber the value of what the losers lost. But if you're one of the people on the losing side, then that probably doesn't matter that much to you. So for instance, over here on the right, if you're somebody who lost your job because of an environmental regulation, or you think that you lost your job because of an environmental regulation, then you're probably not going to be a big fan of environmental regulation. So on the other hand, there's a lot of winners, like the kids. The kids can breathe clean air, and they can drink clean water, and all sorts of other benefits from a clean environment. So we can just stop here at the benefit cost analysis and say, hey, there's net benefits. We're making society better off. But if we ignore the distributional issues and ignore the fact that we're maybe not making it better off for everybody, then we're going to run into some trouble. And this might be why it can be hard, as we'll show you in a bit. I'll show you in a bit that there are these environmental policies where the benefits outweigh the costs. We should be passing them, but nevertheless, they're not getting passed. And maybe it's because of the people who end up worse off. Maybe there are people who end up worse off because of those policies. Okay, and then the question is, you can say, I can measure the net benefits using a cost-benefit analysis, but how do I compare benefits and costs among different people? How do I weigh sort of the outcomes of these cute kids over here with the outcomes of these people who lost their jobs? And that's a tough question, and economists can give people guidance on that issue, but ultimately there's these issues that are raised that are maybe beyond the scope of economics, which is why it's such a tricky issue. All right, so let me show you one graph. Since I'm an economist, let me show you one graph of market failure. So raise your hand if you've seen a graph that sort of looks like this. Well, I think we've all seen supply. That's good. We've all seen supply and demand. And then what's kind of fancy about this graph is that you've got what was the supply curve, this one in blue, and you notice that there's two supply curves. And maybe if you've learned about externalities, the idea here, as I was explaining earlier, is that there's these external costs, like the health damages from pollution. There's a real cost to society that hurt people. They make people sick. They send people to the hospital. Those are real costs to society, but they're not reflected in the market supply curve. So this blue curve on the bottom that we call the private cost, that's sort of the traditional market supply curve. And the invisible hand would say that the supply and demand would reach this equilibrium. They would reach this equilibrium here. But the idea is that would be sort of too much of this output, or too much of this good that's causing this pollution. So this is where the market gets us, and this is where we would like to be. That's the optimal allocation when we're accounting for those costs. And the market doesn't account for those costs. But there are ways that we can tweak the market, that we can fix it just a little bit to get us from where the free market would take us to sort of where we want to be when we're incorporating these costs. So you might have heard of policies that can get you there, like if we put a price on the negative externality, like a tax on pollution. Nobody likes to pay a tax, but the benefit of that tax is it ends up raising that bottom blue curve, the private cost. It raises that up so that it looks like the top blue curve, the social cost curve, and that's going to get us to this ideal equilibrium. The optimum is just where we want to be. So the point here is this is if we understand what's going on in this graph, and if this is the first time you've seen this graph and you don't understand it, that's fine. But the idea is that the invisible hand, that invisible hand that we saw earlier on that graph that wasn't there, the invisible hand takes us there, okay, but that's not where we want to be. The invisible hand does something, but it doesn't do the right thing. We want to move up there. So what we can do is we can just sort of nudge that invisible hand. We can nudge it with a tax, or we can nudge it with some other type of policy, allowing sort of market forces to still be working and working well when they work well, but just modifying them a little bit to get us to the ideal where we want to be. Okay, so that was that was the extent of the graphical analysis that I felt obligated to do after calling myself an economist. So we want policies that get us to the initial equilibrium. And the other thing that we care about, this is the last thing I'll talk about in this intro section, and then we'll talk about an application, is we also care about what economists refer to as cost effectiveness, which is different than a benefit cost analysis. So we want to reduce pollution. Let's say we've made that decision that we want to cut emissions by 20% because we balance or we compare the benefits to pollution reduction with the cost of pollution reductions, and we say we want to reduce pollution by 20% to save a bunch of people's lives and to keep people from being healthier, keep people healthier. But then the question is, how do we do it? There's a whole lot of polluters around. There's big power plants. There's little power plants. There's a lot of cars around. Like all these different actors in the economy are polluting from all sorts of different spots. Who are we going to make reduce that pollution? Are we going to make just the cars reduce pollution? Are we going to make just the power plants reduce pollution? Which power plants are we going to make reduce pollution? Maybe just the coal plants, or maybe it should be just the natural gas plants. So there's these questions of how do we achieve the goal once we decide on a goal. And cost effectiveness analysis, the question of cost effectiveness is, here's an idea. Let's achieve that goal at the lowest possible cost. So if I could reduce emissions of some pollutant by 20%, if I could do that for $200 million, I would rather take that road than having the same emissions reduction but having it cost me $500 million. That seems like a no-brainer, right? Doesn't that seem like pretty obvious? Given a goal, we can argue about what the goal should be, but given a goal, let's achieve it at the cheapest cost. That seems like it should be a no-brainer. But it turns out that the majority of environmental policies that are around in the United States and in the rest of the world are in fact not cost effective. We're pretty sure they're not cost effective. We're pretty sure that of the emissions reductions that we have achieved over the past few decades, we could have achieved the same reductions at a much lower cost if we would have had sort of better designed policy. And here's a bunch of policies that are designed pretty well, a couple of policies that are designed pretty well that turn out to reduce the costs of achieving goals. And really the key that you want is you want flexible policy instruments, what economists can sometimes refer to as market-based instruments or price-based or incentive-based schemes. These are the type of schemes that I was hinting at earlier where you're just sort of tweaking the market a little bit, like by imposing a tax on pollution or by imposing what we call a cap-and-trade scheme. Has anyone ever heard of a cap-and-trade scheme for pollution? No? Just a few people? Does anyone want to explain what cap-and-trade is? Anyone? There's only one person who raised their hand. Do you want to explain or not? No? You gave up? You already answered one question. That's fine. So let me tell you what cap and trade is, because that's good. We should know this. So say we want to reduce pollution by 20%. Okay, so that's what the cap is, right? So let's say pollution has to be 20% lower. So we could set this cap of pollution equal to 80% of what it currently is. And we could assign, so that could be like 800 million tons of some pollutant. And we could assign each of those tons to some polluter. Like if you own a power plant, you get 20 tons worth of pollution. And you own a car, let's say, so you get a ton of pollution. And we could assign that cap across all sorts of different polluters. And then the key thing is the trade part. So you have these rights or these permits to pollute, and then we allow you guys to trade with each other at whatever price you decide to come up with, these permits with each other. And of course, there's a cap of these 800 million tons. And as long as nobody's cheating, we're still going to achieve that cap, right? But when we allow the different polluters to trade with each other, what ends up happening is that sort of by default, sort of by magic, as if there were an invisible hand, we end up achieving that goal at the lowest possible cost. As opposed to if I just allocated those permits and said that's what you have to reduce and you can't change anything, which we typically call command and control regulations. Less flexible policy instruments like mandates. Most environmental regulations are what we call mandates and what are sometimes called command and control regulations, where I just tell individual polluters how much they're going to pollute, and I give them no choice over the matter. And it turns out that you can show with some economic theory, and you can verify in the data that this is actually true, that these less flexible policy instruments like mandates and command and control are costlier to implement than the flexible policy instruments like taxes or cap and trade. For that 20% pollution reduction, it's going to cost a lot more with a mandate than it is with a pollution tax. Okay? So you just told me a couple minutes ago that it's a no-brainer that for a given goal we should achieve it at the lowest cost, but nonetheless most of the policies that we see around us, including the Clean Air Act, tend to be less flexible policy instruments rather than more flexible policy instruments. There's a huge discussion as to why that's the case. Why can't we move towards more flexible policy instruments? And I guess I'll leave that discussion for another time. But you can all become environmental economists, and you can work towards getting these more flexible policy instruments enacted, which would be a good thing. Okay, so that was my overview of how we think about environmental economics, and so maybe you've got an idea, maybe you already had this idea and that didn't help you out much, but now I want to talk about two kind of specific applications that are really related to each other. And the first is climate change. You've all probably heard of that. And this particular sort of set of methods or set of models that economists often use to answer the question of how we should solve climate change. They're called integrated assessment models, or IAMs. Okay, so you might have heard of there's this thing called climate change. So I have a video to show you, but I guess there's no sound. I think there's no sound. So it's just a 60-second long YouTube video that sort of describes climate change in case you haven't seen this. So I'm going to just narrate the video, okay? Like I'll dub it. Okay, so it says an introduction to climate change in 60 seconds. You can barely hear it, but no one can really hear it. So you probably know that we've got the greenhouse effect, the idea that we have, so there it is. The sun's rays come in, and normally what happens is a fraction of the sun's heat sort of bounces out, but a fraction of it is trapped in by the atmosphere, right? And so that's fine. But then what's happening is these gases that, as we're burning fossil fuels, we're increasing the concentration of some of these gases in the atmosphere, in particular carbon dioxide. They're going way up, and we know that carbon dioxide is one of these gases that traps heat, and as a result, temperatures are going way up. That was the air temperature. Here's the ocean temperatures. They're going way up. Oh, and then because temperatures are going up, ice melts, and so sea level rise goes up, snow cover goes down. Oh, look. There's the Arctic sea ice. It's not doing so hot. So we're sort of, you can think of it like there's this blanket where we're covering the Earth in this blanket. We're keeping the heat in, and we think that's not good. 2.6 degrees to 4.8 degrees Celsius is how much we think the temperatures might grow over the next few decades if we do nothing, and that seems to be a lot. Okay, that was my 60-second introduction. I hope that was helpful. So we know the Earth's getting hotter, and we know there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we know that an increase in carbon dioxide concentrations is going to trap heat. So you do the math, and you come to the conclusion that yes, climate change is a real thing. So we can talk a little bit about the science of it. There's these things called greenhouse gases that are the heat-trapping gases, and the big one is carbon dioxide. Every time you drive your car, if you're driving a gasoline-powered car, the combustion that's going on in your car engine, it's taking some carbon that's in the gasoline in your car, which came from petroleum that was in the earth, which came from the dinosaurs or whatever. And it's taking that carbon that was sequestered or that was stored in the earth for millions and millions of years, and it's combining a carbon molecule with two oxygen molecules, and that's what we call combustion. And that creates heat energy that moves the pistons in your car and drives you to where you want to go. And then also as a byproduct, it emits this carbon dioxide molecule. And carbon dioxide, when I talk, it's carbon dioxide as well. We exhale that. So if you're just driving your car across town, no big deal. But if millions and millions of people are driving their cars, and millions of people are using electricity that's powered by coal, and there's millions and millions of people that are heating their homes with natural gas, all this fossil fuel combustion it adds up in the atmosphere, and we saw that in the video where carbon concentrations are much higher, and as a result, temperatures are getting hotter. There are other greenhouse gases as well, but let's sort of just focus on carbon dioxide because kind of everyone focuses on carbon dioxide. Although methane was in the news recently, maybe you heard, because there was this leak in California. Did anybody hear about that? There was this leak at a natural gas facility. They just sort of let a bunch of methane out into the sky. That was pretty bad. And the thing about methane is it's not as There's not as much of it as carbon dioxide, so it's not as big of a deal. But for every sort of ton of methane is a lot more potent than every ton of carbon dioxide. So releasing a lot of methane is a lot worse than releasing the same amount of carbon dioxide. So we already sort of went over the basics of the science. The science isn't too important, other than to note that it's widely agreed upon by everybody that it's happening, and it's likely to keep going unless we do something about it. So, and the point is, the heating of the Earth, causes damages. It causes damage for agriculture. It can raise sea levels, which can damage coastal cities and people who live in coastal areas. It can increase the incidence of diseases like malaria. It can force migration patterns, which could lead to political instability and war. And there's all these sort of unknown damages from the increased temperatures. That's why we care about it. If it just meant that everybody is going to live in a nice, if it just made everybody's climate great, then we wouldn't care about it. It would be a good thing. But it's going to have a lot of bad consequences, we think. So, okay, so there's three things we should know. In addition to what we already know. The first is that the climate deniers will say, we don't know, we just don't know the science. We don't know the science. We can't conclude anything. And there's a certain sense in which they're right. There's a whole lot of uncertainty about this science. I mean, we know climate change is a real thing, but we don't know how big it is, how much it is. So let me show you a graph. This is not an economics model. This is just sort of like a climate model. You can't really read what all these things say. But the point is, this is predictions of how temperature would change. From about now, for 100 years from now, here's temperature increase in degrees Fahrenheit relative to where we started. And you can see that for all these different models, we have no idea. We know there's going to be some climate change, but we don't know. Is it going to be 1 degree Fahrenheit or 1.5 degrees Celsius, or is it going to be all the way up to 6 degrees Celsius? We don't know, and there's a huge difference between an average increase of 10 degrees Fahrenheit and an average increase of just 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Huge differences in terms of sea level rise, in terms of effect on agricultural output, and so on. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty in just the science of climate change. And that's not our fault. That's not economists' fault. That's the scientists' fault. They don't know what they're doing. The second thing to know about climate change that's really important is that it's got this really long time horizon. The thing about carbon dioxide, you emit a ton of it, say, into the air as you drive your car, and it's going to stay there for a long time, like decades and decades, and maybe even a century or longer. Just because the global carbon cycle is so slow, it takes a really long time for that carbon to basically be reabsorbed somewhere else in the Earth. Some of it gets sucked up by the oceans and can get sort of stored back in the oceans. So what that means is that the climate change that we're experiencing now, the fact that it's about 1 or 2 degrees, about a half degree Celsius warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution, all that climate change that we're experiencing now is because of what our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents produced and emitted. And then all the stuff we're doing today is going to increase the temperatures for our kids and grandkids. And so there's this long time horizon problem, which it brings up a bunch of issues about how much you should be reducing pollution now versus later and so on. That's a big issue. And then here's the third big issue that makes it hard, is that so some pollutants that make you sick, what we call conventional pollutants, if there's a power plant here in Murfreesboro, it's going to make the people of Murfreesboro sick. And so Murfreesboro could do something about it. The problem with climate change is that it's this global problem. Every ton, every atom of carbon dioxide that gets released anywhere in the Earth is going way up into the atmosphere, and it's dissipating around the entire planet, and it's warming the entire planet. So all the pollution that we emit is warming up China, and all the pollution that China emits is warming up us and warming up the rest of the world as well. So it's this global problem, and that's why the world has to come together to solve this global problem. And they tried doing it in Paris with hopefully some success. So these are three issues about climate change that make it really, really unique and in a sense, really, really difficult. So what are the options? What can we do about climate change? So sometimes it's framed as the following sort of debate. You've got the hippies on one side who are saying, we've got to immediately transition to a carbon neutral or a carbon-free society. Stop driving your cars and let's just get all our energy from solar and wind. And then you've got the other people, the corporate shills, who are just saying, oh, stop, we don't need to do anything. We don't know what's going on. It's just a myth. So it's like these are your two options. But of course, we're economists where we look at costs and benefits. And economists, we probably realize that we're not at a corner solution. The optimal policy is not. That there are costs from doing nothing. There are big costs from stopping emitting all greenhouse gases now. And so sort of the right solution is probably somewhere in between those two extreme poles. And by the way, costs and benefits. So hopefully we know that the costs of doing nothing are that the climate change keeps going on, it gets the world hotter, and a lot of people die, and a lot of people lose their jobs, and the economy suffers. So those are the costs of doing nothing. But there's also huge costs of doing what the hippies say and just immediately stopping all greenhouse gas output right now. Does anyone know what those costs would be? What would be costly about doing this?
Looting, crime, violence.
And yeah, why would there be looting, crime, and violence?
People, not everybody's going to give up what they have.
Yeah, you can't watch TV. Yeah. You can't watch Netflix without fossil fuels, right? Like everything, we can't have economic seminars. I mean, the country runs on energy, and energy is primarily fueled by fossil fuels. So no, I mean, nobody really, this is a straw person argument. Nobody really says that we should, I don't think seriously says that we should stop doing this now, but that's sort of the extreme idea, that no matter what the costs, we should just move towards carbon neutrality. We can't do that right away because our whole economy, our whole infrastructure is based on burning fossil fuels. But what we can do is we can try to transition to an economy where in the future we'll move away from burning fossil fuels, and maybe even in the future we'll stop, but not immediately. So there's clearly something in between. There's some what we would call optimal or best level of emissions reduction, and the fancy word that we use for emissions reductions is abatement. So there's some optimal level of abatement that's going to sort of just, in comparing those benefits and costs of those two extremes, it's going to get us the highest net benefits. So the cost of reducing emissions, compare those with the benefits, and we want to get the highest net benefits. That's how we do sort of cost-benefit analysis to get optimal policy. And then the question is, what is that optimal level of abatement? Is it 100%, what they say over there on the left, or is it 0%, what they say over there on the right? Probably neither. It's probably somewhere in between. What is it? I mean, how do we answer that question? How do we even go about sort of addressing that question? What's the way do we do that? I mean, I just mentioned how complicated this issue is on all these dimensions. How are we going to be able to start answering that question? So we have an answer. One way is to hire the economists and let the economists calculate these sort of complicated computational models. And there's a set of these models that people started calling integrated assessment models. So you have this sort of economic model of economic growth, of capital investment and consumption. And if you've taken economics classes, especially if you've taken macroeconomics classes, you might be familiar with these types of models. And then you have a model that you steal from the science people, the climate scientists. It's a model of how carbon concentrations affect temperatures and how that changes over time. And then you put the two models together. That's the integrated part. And then you click Run on your either on your desktop or on some supercomputer somewhere else, and you watch what the model does, and you can use this model to solve for the policy, the level of abatement that maximizes net benefits, that compares those costs of abatement, how costly it would be to reduce carbon pollution, and compares it to all the good stuff we get from lower carbon pollution, like the fact that cities aren't going to be underwater. And then you maximize the net benefits, and that's the assessment part, right? You're assessing what you should be doing. You click Run. And these models have different degrees of complexity. They have different assumptions behind them. Some of them have really kind of complicated climate models, like really complicated climate science models, and then really simple economic models. And then some of them have these really complicated multi-sector economic models, but then their climate science models are not very complicated, and so on. And they have these clever names that stand for something. So DICE is one of them. That's the one we'll talk about. DICE stands for Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model. And then there's a model called FUND that stands for something, and a model called PAGE, and you can come up with a bunch of others. You can search and find a bunch of other models. And there's teams of economists and scientists who are designing these models, who are running these models, and they're churning out papers, and the models are telling them how much we should be reducing policy. And you might think that's just a bunch of scientists in their ivory tower just playing with their models, but it turns out that the output of these integrated assessment models is being used now in policy assessment by governments, including by the federal government. When the federal government makes these, when the EPA does sort of cost-benefit analysis of policies to look at the benefits of, say, carbon reductions, they use the output from these integrated assessment models. And in particular, in some of the assessments, they take these sort of the top 3 models and they kind of balance out what the three models say. So it's not just these kind of academic exercises. These numbers are currently being used for policy analysis and policy guidance. So let's take a look at some output, like what the output for one of these models would be. So all of these models, there's been lots and lots of papers and lots of sort of different runs of these models. So I just took a run of the DICE model from a recent paper, and I think it was in the journal Nature Climate Change. And it was run by this team of economists and scientists, and they ran the model. And so first of all, the one thing to note about this graph is there's a whole bunch of curves. There's these 3 blue curves here and the 3 green curves. These are all from the same climate model. They're all giving optimal policy, but just with different assumptions behind the climate model. So even within one model, if you tweak the assumptions, you can get different sort of predictions about what we should be doing. And let's spend some time looking at the outputs of this particular model. So we're simulating it for a few years, and the y-axis here is the percentage of emissions that are abated or reduced, right? So this is like the optimal abatement level. And what we're seeing in this model, depending on whether you're this set of blue lines, which is sort of like the low damages assumption, or the set of green lines, which is the high damages assumption, you sort of start out with kind of moderate levels of pollution reduction, reduce your pollution by, say, 15 to 30%. That was the question we asked a while ago. How much? That's how much, 15 to 30%. And then over time, you start increasing the abatement. So you're polluting less. You're increasing how much of that pollution you're cutting down on. So there's your answer. But of course, that's just one run of the model, and even under different specifications, you get different results. The optimal, in 50 years, the optimal level could be 25% cut. It could be a 50% cut. Even with the same model, we don't know. And then as a result of those optimal abatement cuts, you can see what happens to emissions. The idea is the economy is growing and growing, so emissions are still increasing for the next 50 to 100 years, but then eventually the emissions drop off, and even eventually we stop polluting altogether in the next 150 or 200 years. Okay? So these models are saying we do eventually want to stop polluting, but it's going to take a lot of time before we get there, because it's so costly to transition to this zero carbon society. So the environmentalists would love this because they'd say, yeah, we're going zero carbon society. That's what we want. Except that it won't be for another 150 to 200 years, just because of the costs of making that transition. So we want to reduce pollutions, but we want to reduce pollution. We want to do it rather slowly, not too fast. And as a result, if we look at what happens to temperature, this is what happens. We are, in fact, allowing temperature to rise, according to this model, for the next at least 150 years. So the y-axis here is the degrees above what the average temperatures were before the Industrial Revolution, before we started emitting all of these burning all these fossil fuels and emitting all these greenhouse gases. We're already at about a half a degree Celsius, more than a half a degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and these models are pretty much telling us we still are going to grow. And notice that even though there are big differences in the abatement rate for the first few years, the temperature changes between all these different curves isn't very different for the next 50 years. That's because of what I mentioned a few slides ago, that this is such a long time horizon problem that the temperature increases in the near future, like in our lifetimes, my lifetime, is pretty much already cooked in from what's happened in the past. But then in 100 years or so, we can see that under this one scenario, we allow temperatures to rise almost to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, or maybe even up to 4 degrees Celsius. These are the optimal predictions of what we should be doing. Okay, and again, that was just one IAM, just one paper that came out about a year ago. There's dozens and dozens of papers with just this model, and there's a couple dozen models, okay? So there's a lot of different results. And of course, the results vary on what model you use and how you specify it, the assumptions that you make. We didn't talk about any of the assumptions about how they're different, but there's a lot of assumptions. But generally, you do get some results. You do get a set of consistent results, which is that what we saw is this sort of ramping up of policy. We want to kind of start now with moderate levels of emissions reductions. We don't want to go all in now because that'd be too costly. We want to keep ramping up. As society grows, as the economy grows, we can afford to abate more, where there's going to be technological growth in abatement technology. So we're going to ramp up with this goal of eventually eliminating carbon dioxide emissions. But it's not going to be today, and it's not going to be tomorrow. It might be in 100 or 200 years because it's so costly to make that transition, according to these models. And so what that means then is that even under this optimal scenario case, even accounting for the fact that there's all these costs of climate change, the cities could flood and people could get sick and all these damages that are in the models, even accounting for that, we still are going to allow the planet to get pretty warm, 2 to 3 degrees Celsius on average warmer, which could have substantial damages, but it's because the costs of avoiding that are so high. And as you might guess, there's some people who don't like this result. They don't like this result that says, even accounting for damages, you still sort of want to allow climate change to happen at this pretty substantial rate. People don't like that. And there's a lot of reasons people don't like it. Well, some people just sort of don't like it because they don't like what it says, and they don't have a really good criticism of the model. But there are some pretty good criticisms of IAMs, of these models. So one is that scientists, including economists, have this bias towards conservatism, and by conservatism, I'm not talking about political conservatism. I'm talking about scientific conservatism, which is that you really want to avoid making a claim about something, about some phenomenon, unless you're really certain it's true. And in the case of climate change, we mentioned there's all this uncertainty. Scientists and economists find themselves being hesitant to sort of put these damages into the model unless they're pretty sure that the damages are in there. And so kind of almost everyone agrees, even the people who work with these IAM models, that the damages are that are in these models are really just a subset of all the damages. They're only the things that we can measure. In particular, we look at effects on agricultural production and effects on migration patterns. These are some things that we can at least try to measure. But there probably are higher damages. We're probably too conservative, and therefore the models are spitting out recommendations that are not stringent enough. We should be abating more than the model tells us. So that's a valid criticism. The model sort of assumes that there's this growth in technology, and of course technology is unpredictable. We don't know how much it could grow. We just make an assumption about how much it grows and then solve for the model. So we could have this huge breakthrough in technological innovation in 5 years that could, could solve the problem in 5 years. Probably won't happen, but it might. But it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, and especially about technology in the future. And then the other point about a criticism is that the policy itself could affect the growth of technology. And some of these IAMs account for that sort of feedback loop, but most of the IAMs don't account for that policy feedback loop, the endogeneity of technology. And then there's a set of critiques which sort of just argue that there's so much uncertainty about every part of this process that these IAMs are just inherently uncertain, and they're sort of misleading because they make you think we know that this optimal level is 15% or 30%. Even though I showed you a bunch of curves, even that, according to this critique, is misleading. We can't even pinpoint it down to being between 15 and 30%. So just this idea that the models are too simple to capture this complex system. There's some really smart people who are making those types of arguments. Maybe they're right. And then this is maybe the one I started with, this sort of catch-all concern that just IAMs or cost-benefit analysis is just not the way we should be studying environmental policy. I'm not that sympathetic with that last criticism, but maybe somebody else is. Okay, so but I guess I ended on these criticisms, but it gives us a tool to address this complicated issue of climate change. Okay, so if you're interested, we can talk more about that later. But now I want to move on to this last thing I want to talk about today, which is related to climate change. It's something I'm working on and I'm kind of excited about, and it's geoengineering. Has anyone heard of geoengineering? Will you raise your hand? A few people have heard of geoengineering. Okay, it's pretty cool. And so let's go back and think about climate change and what we could do about climate change. And there's basically 4 things we could do about this problem. The first thing that we could do about climate change is what we're currently doing, which is this. We could either pretend it doesn't happen, or say it's happening, but say that we can't afford to do anything. And that's roughly what like the United States and most governments in the world which don't currently have any climate policies, that's roughly what they're doing. And then what we've been talking about for most of today, for the past 20 minutes, is reducing emissions. We can stop emitting as much carbon dioxide. We call that abatement. Option number 3, which I want to bring up, but I'm not going to talk about that too much, the idea of adaptation is we know it's going to happen. Things like sea levels are going to rise. The Earth's going to get warmer. So we have to sort of deal with that in some way. So that might involve moving coastal cities inland, or it might involve changing the crops that farmers grow at different latitudes because we know it's going to get warm. So adaptation is something that we could do. Then there's this other option, which people are just beginning to talk about, geoengineering. And what do we mean by that? It's a way to deal with climate change. But so it's not ignoring it, like number 1, and it's not just dealing with it, like number 3. We're trying to stop it from happening. We're trying to reduce temperatures, but we're doing it in a way other than by reducing emissions. All right? How can we do that? Well, there's 2 broad sort of types of geoengineering, 2 broad categories. And within each of these categories, there's a bunch of different options. The first is pretty self-explanatory. There's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Let's just get rid of it. Let's suck it out. Let's remove the carbon dioxide that we've already emitted from the atmosphere. So CDR, carbon dioxide removal. Maybe through something like this. So this is, you'd build like a big thing. Sometimes they call these artificial trees, because real trees suck up carbon dioxide. And these are like giant fans, turbines, and they suck in the air, and then there's this chemical reaction that goes in, and it sort of sucks the carbon dioxide out. This picture, by the way, is fake. We don't have this technology yet, right? So this is some prototype. Somebody did this in Photoshop. We don't actually have these things in the desert, but this is the idea behind carbon dioxide removal, is that you could have something like this. I don't want to talk too much about carbon dioxide removal. What I want to talk about is the other type of geoengineering, which we can call solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. So there's a few ways we could do that. The idea of solar geoengineering is that the carbon dioxide is trapping the heat that's coming into the Earth's atmosphere. So let's just prevent heat from getting there in the first place, or reduce the amount of incoming sunlight, the amount of incoming heat energy that hits the Earth. And that way there's not as much heat to trap. And there's a bunch of ways you can do that. It turns out if you paint your roofs white, that's going to reduce global warming. You might have heard of that. You can also grow certain types of crops that are more reflective. Clouds are reflective, so if there was a way that we could sort of increase cloud cover, that would do it. And there's people who have talked about technologies to do that. Maybe the most sort of far out there technologies, literally, are the sun shields, where you can like put like large mirrors into orbit that would sort of literally block out the sun. But the one that we sort of focus on because it looks like it's going to be the most realistic is this, the sulfate particles or sulfur geoengineering. We know that if we put these sulfur particles into the upper atmosphere, that they'll block sort of a tiny fraction of the incoming sunlight. We know this will work because it's what happens when there are these large volcanic eruptions, these natural volcanic eruptions. They spit out a bunch of stuff into the air, including sulfur. It stays up there for like a year or so, and in the past, these large volcanic eruptions have dropped worldwide temperatures by like 0.5 degree. So we could just do that artificially. We could get a bunch of planes. It turns out that it wouldn't be that expensive to do it, so let's go on. Sounds crazy, but let's go on, and let me tell you why we're talking about it. So the first thing to note is that so that's an option. That's one of our 4 options. So perhaps we should sort of include that in our analysis, but it turns out that most of these integrated assessment models don't, except one that I'll tell you about. So here's some facts that we should know about their cost. Sucking the carbon dioxide directly out is really, really expensive, way more expensive than just not emitting it in the first place. So it doesn't look like CDR passes a reasonable kind of cost-benefit analysis. So let's throw that out. But here's the thing. Solar radiation management, in particular, getting the airplanes to spew the sulfur into the upper atmosphere to block a tiny fraction of the sunlight, that's going to be very, very cheap. We're pretty sure that's very, very cheap. Like, we're pretty sure that, like, Bill Gates could do it, like, over a weekend. You know, it would be sizable but not majority sort of fraction of his net worth to sort of hire these planes and get the sulfur somewhere and just have people reduce temperatures. And we're pretty sure it would work because we've seen in the past that it has worked with these volcanic eruptions. But as you might guess, there's some drawbacks. There's these uncertainties about what the side effects might be. So there's a lot of people who are worried that putting all these sulfates up into the atmosphere could cause these unintended consequences. It's something we haven't done on this scale. So it could have these and maybe potentially other unintended consequences. So we don't really know what those are, how costly they would be. This is really speculative. We don't know. And then another issue is that it doesn't reduce carbon dioxide emissions, or it doesn't reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at all. It just blocks the sunlight. So in a sense, it's not addressing the root cause. And that actually turns out to be important because the carbon dioxide itself leads to these other damages besides just temperature increases. In particular, you might have heard of this phenomenon of ocean acidification. The carbon that we're emitting up into the air, a bunch of it gets sucked up by the ocean, and that decreases the pH. I think that decreases the pH, which makes the ocean more acidic, and that hurts a lot of ocean wildlife. And in particular, like shellfish and coral, they can't form their stuff. And some shellfish fishermen and women are already beginning to see some effect on the fishery stocks from ocean acidification. SRM won't do anything about that. Oh, darn. So that's a problem. We have to assess this. But nonetheless, we should be able to sort of incorporate all of this into an integrated assessment model. And so some co-authors and I have done this, and I'll share with you some of those results. Although this, because, I mean, keep this in mind, right? A lot of this is really speculative. We don't really know what these damages are, what they should be. We have to make assumptions, just like in all of these integrated assessment models. So let's spend 5 or so minutes looking at some of these results, which I hope you'll find kind of interesting. Okay, so so there's 3 curves here, and here's our, the x-axis is the time, how many years, so we're simulating way out into the future, 500 years from today. And then the y-axis is this fraction between 0 and 1. And for the red and the blue lines, these are abatement intensities, so you might remember sort of we started abating about 15% and kind of gradually went up. And in our model, it sort of, after about 250 or so years, you abate at this 100% intensity. The difference between the red line and the blue line is that the red line is the model without solar geoengineering, without solar radiation management, without the geoengineering option. So this is like what the DICE model, the models that I was showing you before, looked something like this, the red line. Now, when you add in geoengineering, this is how much you should abate in the blue line. And so you're abating less at any period. You don't need to abate as much. Like, for example, 100 years from now, without geoengineering, we have to reduce about 40 or 45% of emissions. But with geoengineering, that's only down to about 35%. We're still doing some emissions reductions, but not as much. And the explanation is that geoengineering is a substitute for emissions abatement, right? It's an alternative technology to reduce temperatures. We want to reduce temperatures partially through abatement and partially through geoengineering. And this, the green line, is then how much geoengineering we should do. We're ramping that up eventually. And then you can kind of see, this sort of makes sense. As soon as we stop abating after about 200 years, then we don't need to do as much of the geoengineering. So that sort of slowly drifts off. We still need to do some of it because, remember, there's this long time horizon. All those carbon dioxide molecules are still going to be in the air for a long time. So this kind of demonstrates that there's this trade-off between the two technologies that, of course, you don't get in a model that doesn't have one of the two technologies. This is how much carbon we're allowing, the concentration in gigatons of carbon, or I guess the mass in gigatons of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And when we allow solar geoengineering, which is the blue line, there's more carbon because we've abated less. We're allowing the Earth to have more of these heat-trapping gases in them. So you'd think that's a bad thing. But of course, there's also now there's solar geoengineering where we're putting these sulfates in the atmosphere and blocking some of the sun light that's coming in. So now if you look at temperature, the y-axis here is the average temperature, you see that when we allow solar geoengineering, the blue curve, we can keep temperatures a lot cooler than we can under the optimal policy where there's just abatement. Like about half as much in terms of the temperature increase from the pre-industrial levels. We can keep the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius without geoengineering, according to this sort of DICE model, the standardized model, temperatures are going to go up to about 3 or 3.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So we're suggesting here that the way to achieve this goal of keeping temperatures in check could be through solar geoengineering. It could be a more cost-effective way. Of course, we talked about assumptions that go behind this model and uncertainty. There's a lot of assumptions that we needed to rely on to get this result. We tried to be conservative. There's that word again, not politically conservative, but we tried to be conservative in the sense of trying to make geoengineering kind of look as bad as possible. We didn't want to appear to be biased pro-geoengineering. So those damages for geoengineering, which were very uncertain, those question marks, we sort of made those really, really high, sort of implausibly high, as high as the damages from climate change itself. Right? So the cure could be just as bad as the disease in this model. And even under that scenario, you still have a substantial role of geoengineering to play, and that's because it's so cheap and because abatement is so expensive in the near term. So I mentioned that it's a substitute, geoengineering is a substitute for emissions reduction, what we called abatement. So if we allow it, we get to use less abatement, right? You can use more of the substitute and less of the original thing. But for a couple of reasons, it's an imperfect substitute. Well, the reason it's an imperfect substitute is that it doesn't address the root cause of climate change, these carbon dioxide emissions. They're still around. So it's addressing just sort of a fraction of the total damages. And so a consequence of that is just like the environmentalists like, just like the environmentalists want, and just like the standard IAMs tell us, eventually you do want to get to full 100% abatement. You want to stop emitting carbon dioxide altogether. The point is that with geoengineering, you just put that date off. You push it a little bit farther in the future because of this alternate technology that's a substitute, although not a perfect substitute. So that might make you unhappy if you're a climate hawk, if you're a hardcore environmentalist. But this third bullet should make you happy, which is that when we allow for geoengineering, we can in fact keep temperatures a lot lower than if we just have abatement. Because solar geoengineering is a pretty good way to keep temperatures low, a pretty cheap, easy way to do it, even though it might have these side effects. Okay, so you might disagree with this. You might think it's crazy, but hopefully the idea is you understand how we're thinking about this problem from an economic perspective, how we're thinking about costs and benefits, and how we're thinking about sort of maximizing net benefits, looking at different technologies and their costs and their benefits to get this optimal set of policy tools, which may include this newfangled policy. And it could be totally wrong because all the assumptions could be wrong behind the model. But I think the way of thinking about it is right, even if the numbers themselves are not right. So hopefully that gave you an idea. So to recapitulate, so we start out with this introduction and then these two kind of applications which were related to each other. There's the integrated assessment models with climate change, which people have done for a long time, and then there's what we're just starting to do now, which is incorporating geoengineering into these integrated assessment models. And we can begin to say, this is how this is how economists think about the environment. We realize that there are huge benefits to protecting the environment, that there are these market failures. The free market's not going to do it on its own. We need government intervention. But then we also realize that these interventions are costly. We can't just go all the way and cure all the environmental problems overnight. So we have to have some sort of structure for analyzing those trade-offs. And I think these types of models are a good way to think about that, and a valuable contribution that economics has made to the environmental policy discussion. Okay, thanks. Mm-hmm.
And how do the models predict human population growth?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the models have assumptions about both so the model that I've used, DICE, it's just an aggregate model. So all they care about is sort of total production and total output. They don't care about how many people are in the model. So the economy is growing over time, part of that growth is because there's more people, and part of that is because each person is consuming more. So in the particular models I showed you, they didn't address that question. But there's this big issue of population growth and population dynamics and how that interrelates with environmental policy in general and climate policy in particular. So there's a team, there's a group of people who are really convinced that an important and necessary policy tool is to reduce population growth as much as possible. There's this movement called ZPG, Zero Population Growth, this argument goes back way back into this guy named Thomas Malthus, who was this famous economist who came up with this sort of theory that as population grows with a finite planet with limited resources, that you're going to run out eventually. So this is the Malthusian theory of growth, which is that there cannot be growth eventually. And then there's this debate about whether that argument is true. The idea being that as population grows, technology grows as well, so we can sort of get more out of the resources that we have. So it's not clear to me that population control is a necessary or even important component of optimal policy. But a lot of smarter people have studied it, and there's a lot more to be said about that.
So when we say this is an optimal policy, that means there's some objective we're maximizing. How do these models handle that?
Yeah, that's good. So it's pretty straightforward in the model like the one I showed you. There's just, like I said, we just sort of care about total output, total production. And you just want to maximize the total output that's available to the economy. So there's a sense in which, in the DICE model anyways, it's not really a trade-off between the economy and the environment, because the damages from climate change are damaging the environment and therefore damaging the economy. We can't produce as much when climate change is affecting us. And we just want to maximize the net amount that we can produce, that people can consume, that can make people happy and make people enjoy their lives. So because this model is so simple, it's not difficult to answer that question. But there could be more complicated models where you have different types of consumption goods, and then you have to make stronger assumptions about what it is that you're trying to maximize.
And presumably environmental quality is an input to some of these outputs.
Yeah, exactly. In the DICE model, there's just one output. And the higher the temperatures are, it sort of reduces how much you can produce every year. Sure, that should all be kind of incorporated into that aggregate damage function.
So let's just say we take geo as a very quick logical conclusion, and we reach the point where we can basically have a thermostat of the Earth.
Yep.
Is there an optimum temperature for us to go for?
Yeah, well, that's what I just showed you. I mean, if you believe all the assumptions in that model, I just showed you the optimal temperature. And that sort of ramps up over time. And that's because we can set the temperature to what we want, but it's not costless. It's pretty cheap for the planes to pay for the planes, but there's these side effects, these damages that are very costly. So in trading off the cost and benefits, we get the curve that you saw.
What would that temperature be? Like 70 degrees average temperature?
Well, we usually think about it in terms of degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial average, so it was about 2. That was in about 100 years, we'd be 2 degrees hotter than we were before the Industrial Revolution, and then that would go down after that. And so it's funny that we got that result of 2 degrees Celsius, because there's this big debate in the policy literature that 2 degrees Celsius is the goal that we should be hoping to achieve. And that number, that goal of 2 degrees Celsius, kind of came out of nowhere, just because it's sort of a round number. And there's some scientific models that might suggest that some different things could happen once we reach 2 degrees average warming, but it really was kind of like a fuzzy goal. So it was this massive coincidence that our model spit out that happened to be the right target, only when there is solar geoengineering. Without it, it's going to be even hotter.
Are the costs for cap and trade, are they also associated with the secondary market too, of the actual sales of those?
The permits?
That tonnage permit?
What do you mean by the secondary markets?
Because I'm sure that people are being issued these permits, and then once their company requires more and another company requires less, they can sell these permits.
Uh-huh.
And that creates that secondary market, right?
Right.
So is that secondary market kind of incorporated into that cost, or do people even, is that, the government's like, we've done our part? we don't need to do anymore.
Well, so the basic, simplest model would just be that you want people to trade, right? So you want this market and pollution permits to occur. So sort of, the more trading, the better, unless you happen to, the initial allocation happens to be perfect. But then maybe the issue, what you're asking is that there could be sort of like financial malfeasance or shenanigans, people manipulating the market, like people might have hypothetically like manipulated the market for mortgage-backed securities or something like that. There's some research that's sort of looking at that, about whether there could be kind of, I don't know how to describe it, like these sort of financial frictions in those types of markets. Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know what the literature has come down on one side or the other.
I have a question. How do you account for the growth in technology and its potential? Or is that one of the things that you're just conservative on? You're saying maybe we'll have 2% technological growth and whatever that may deal with, or do you have a more solid foundation?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So you pick a number, 2% or 3%, whatever number. We just took the number that the standard dice model had used, but when they first designed the dice model, they did a lot of research into you look at past growth rates and then you make projections based on what is seen in the past. But the point is that it's just an assumption, right? The technology could grow a lot faster or it could grow a lot slower, and it could grow different speeds in different sectors. Like the clean energy sector, technology growth could way take off, and that could change things. And we don't know what technological growth is going to look like. We know if it looked exactly like it does in the models, then that's what the world would look like, but it might not look like that. So it's not that it's made up, it's sort of calibrated, and people think about it carefully, but it is a prediction, it's a guess, and it's a necessary input in the model. Yeah.
Would it not be more valuable to take the solar geoengineering from the second model and apply it to the policies necessary for creating the abatement in the first model, so that you could, in some ways, even get a greater effect on the overall temperature over time? Because if you maintain the same abatement and then apply geoengineering, you could ostensibly bring that lower.
Yes, but if you believe everything about the model with geoengineering, doing what you just said would be worse for society than what that showed, because the model that I showed you is maximizing net benefits. It's maximizing what our optimum for society should be, which is net consumption. And because the geoengineering is a substitute for abatement, when you're optimizing, you actually want to use a little bit less abatement because you don't need to, so you can avoid some of those costs. If you just stuck with the same abatement and then added geoengineering, it would definitely reduce temperatures, but it would increase costs, and sort of your net output or your net utility would go down, according to that model.
Would the overall time frame, or time frame, I suppose, be cut down though? Would it not occur overall faster?
So you have the abatement path that is the optimal without geoengineering, and you don't change the thing about that, but then you add in geoengineering, then yeah, temperatures are going to come down faster than they would. Right? The carbon concentrations won't change because geoengineering doesn't do anything about the carbon concentrations, but the temperature would go down faster. But I submit that would actually be costlier on net because my model's right. Yeah.
In the beginning, you saw like the temperature rising from 1.6 to 6 degrees Celsius.
Mm-hmm.
When you do your geoengineering model, do you tend to just pick the middle for what you think you're going to have to reduce it at? Or do you tend to pick that worst one or the
I see.
one?
So yeah, that early on in the talk, I showed the temperature went from 1 to 6, and those models, like I said, were just like scientific predictions.
Right.
So one of those predictions is underlying the optimal policy predictions in the geoengineering model, and the question is which one. So yeah, it's like roughly one of the ones near the middle. But what you can do is you can do sensitivity analysis. You can like look at different values for that measure of how sensitive the climate is to carbon concentrations, and see how that changes optimal policy. So the numbers that I just showed you were assuming one particular number, but you can sort of rerun the model assuming a different number, and you'd get different results. And in fact, that's one of the key parameters. It's actually called climate sensitivity, and it's calibrated usually as, or defined usually as, the the temperature increase in degrees Celsius above pre-industrial that would result from a doubling of atmospheric carbon concentrations. So if we went, so right now we haven't quite doubled atmospheric concentrations yet. We're like 40% higher than they were pre-industrial. But if we went to, and we're about 0.6 degrees Celsius above, but if we went to double, how much would that increase temperatures? We don't really know, but we think it's 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's what we used in our model.
You mentioned that there's historical evidence that volcanic eruptions release material to help reduce global temperature. I was just wondering, I don't suppose anybody's ever done a study of the cost benefits of inducing a volcanic eruption.
Oh, yeah? No, I haven't heard that one. Yeah, I haven't heard that. No, but it's funny you say that. Yeah, so I think that would be a lot costlier than just hiring the planes to do it. But I did see a paper that you might have read about in the media that came out in Science Journal, and it was suggesting that a slightly more efficient method of solar geoengineering, rather than using sulfate particles, would be using small diamond particles. Because I guess they would stay up in the atmosphere a little bit longer and they wouldn't react. One of the risks of the sulfate particles is they would react with formation of ozone and they would deteriorate the ozone layer. So diamonds wouldn't do that. But I thought that paper was funny because, of course, that's ridiculously costly. Like, yeah. Well, there's that too. Depends where they fell.
Ridiculously cheap to artificially make.
What's that?
Diamonds are actually ridiculously cheap to artificially produce, as long as you're not using magnesium diamonds.
Oh, yeah, so maybe there's some cheaper production technology, yeah. But the point is this paper didn't look at costs at all, which is fine. You can do a scientific journal article without looking at costs, but it's likely costly. Sulfates are cheap, too.
Just real quick, was the sulfates using an individual plane, or was it actually just like attaching it to like airlines?
No, well, I've read, no, they fly in the, what's it called, the lower stratosphere, the upper troposphere, which is a little bit higher than passenger jets fly, lower than the outer space. But they could basically be like passenger jets that would be sort of slightly modified. But the idea is they would sort of just be like full-time sulfate sprayers, right? Sort of like crop dusters, but they would be full-time. And I've heard that it could be like a few dozen airplanes for the entire planet, sort of going full-time. And I've heard that it would cost on the order of like $100 million a year worldwide, which is way, way cheaper than how much it would cost to reduce carbon dioxide emissions.
By full time, you mean nonstop, every hour of every day?
Well, I mean, maybe you get a bathroom break. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how long. But yeah, basically, you have a fleet of planes, and their whole job is to seed the sulfates in the atmosphere. And it's not that many planes, a few dozen.
Is the cost model taking into account drone technology or no?
What technology?
Drone technology, like unmanned planes doing it.
I don't know. Maybe. Pilots are cheap, too. And you still have to pay the pilot if it drone pilot.
Thank you all for your questions.
All right, thanks.